Norby is a fun education game that helps kids improve their reading skills using speech recognition. And I started the project about 4 years ago now, originally for my daughter, who was 5 years old at the time. I remember sitting down with her for the first time, going through some of her workbooks, and she was just really struggling with a lot of the conventional learning material out there. It was just boring her to tears. And I remember sitting down with her, trying to help her out with some of that stuff and looking at it and thinking to myself, this is exactly the same stuff that bore me to tears 30 years ago as well. Things have obviously changed a lot for that batch of kids. Like they're used to having these really rich and interactive experiences playing, things like video games like Fortnite and Minecraft and so on. And I think what's happened at a more kind of macro level is that because those experiences are so rich and they have a lot of production value, it's created this very dramatic contrast between what happens at home with YouTube and games and Netflix versus what's happening with some of the education apps that are really based on technology that's like at this point maybe 20 years old. And when you kind of take these kids and you sort of flip them from one context to another, the gap feels very, very big at the moment. I think the other thing that really stood out in that process is that we know that there's a big variation from one kid to the next, and this is something that we've experienced a lot doing all the testing with parents and kids that come into our office. And it felt to me when we started working on this project that the approach from a lot of the providers was very much this one-size-fits-all approach, where irrespective of the individual circumstances of the kid, they kind of all got the same thing. So you could have 3 8-year-olds where one is bored in school because they're a year in front of the curriculum and the existing stuff is struggling to keep their attention. You have another kid where they may have some form of learning difficulty, so dyslexia or ADHD or ISD and so on, where they need a different approach. And then you might have another kid where they're, say, newly immigrated to the country and they're trying to learn English as a second language. So on paper, they're all kids, they're all 8 years old, they all have to learn things. But when you kind of drill down underneath that veneer, the circumstances are very different. We've really taken a lot of cues from companies outside of education. So if you thought of companies like, say, Netflix or Spotify, they have some similarities in terms of they're both entertainment companies, they're all based on delivering content. But the big thing is underneath the surface, they have this personalization engine, right? And you could imagine as an end user what the world would be like if everyone got the same Spotify playlist or the same Netflix account. It would be not good. But that's, I think, the approach that most of the education providers have taken. So on our end, what we're looking at doing is basically identifying all of those different dials, whether it be, say, the particular interest of the kid. One of the really common problems we've had come past our office is parents coming in who have a child, for example, that has dyslexia, and they might be, for example, 10 or 11 years old. So from a cognitive perspective, from a gameplay perspective, they want to play games that are appropriate for a 10 or an 11-year-old, but their reading level might be kind of closer to, say, a 7-year-old. And what happens is, if a parent goes out and buys an application that has a curriculum for a 10 or an 11-year-old, it's too difficult for them. And then on the other hand, if they go out and they buy an app that's built for a 7-year-old, the curriculum is right, but the gameplay is just, it bores them to tears and they kind of look at it as something that's for babies. Yeah. So just being able to identify those individual dials and then build a system where we can sort of turn them and customize them to each kid. For us, I think the appeal of the speech recognition is twofold. One is that it creates that dynamic where you can't really cheat the system. In order to be able to progress, you actually have to be able to read what's on the screen. So that was a big thing. The other thing I think, and this is probably something I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't know until I sort of became a parent, was this idea of the production effect. Basically stating that the best way to be able to get kids to read, especially at the early ages, is to get them to produce the sound, so to read aloud, which is essentially why if you popped into any school around the world and you looked at kids that were fairly young, getting them to read aloud is such a big focus. And it's something where there's been, at this point, decades of research on this. It's something that's been replicated well. And we know that just that act of being able to verbalize the words and the sentences has two effects. One is that it really helps with being able to remember the word better, as opposed to just silently reading it. And two, it actually helps enhance their understanding of the word. If I kind of think back when we initially discovered SoapBox, I can tell you our life would have been tremendously easier had we been able to find you guys in the beginning, but sometimes there's no way to sort of avoid that learning curve. So we'd started experimenting with all the usual suspects. So we'd signed up and we'd used stuff from Google Cloud, we'd used the Amazon stuff, we'd used some of the Microsoft stuff. And off memory, I think the issue that there was multiple issues depending on the provider, and we would just run into things like, all right, we'd find one engine that was really good in a particular area, and then they would have some blind spots. And we'd go to the next engine and they would be good in those blind spots, but they would have their own issues. And we kind of end up in this scenario where we wanted to, Frankenstein different parts of the system together. So once we found SoapBox, that was a big deal in terms of, okay, we can deal with the one provider. We don't have to create this Frankenstein system where we're kind of pulling things from different places. And I think maybe the last thing, which was a big thing, is being able to get that more granular phonemic data, which is a big thing in our case, especially with kids at the younger ages. With a lot of the other engines, I think the scenario we were in was basically a very blunt instrument where it's like pass or fail and nothing in between. That was a game changer. In the case of getting into that personalization and having something that has depth specifically for kids, it's a really complicated problem to solve, right? Like because kids have such different speech patterns and you need to be able to cater for such a wide variety of different ages and accents, having something that's robust across all those dimensions is pretty important. It's always nice to be able to kind of work on something that you think has the potential to sort of change the trajectory of your kids' lives. I sort of made the decision fairly early on that this was something that I was going to spend my working career working on. I would love to kind of be around and be a fly on the wall and I guess see what version of Norby's in the world when my kids have kids. Like that's kind of a big goal for me.